April 14, 1944. 0537 hours. Monte Cassino sector, Italian front. The hill was silent except for the sound of metal scraping dirt. Corporal William Dutch Hauser crouched beside the smoking wreck of a Sherman M4A1, its left track blown apart, turret canted at an unnatural angle. The crew hadn't made it out. He didn't look at the bodies. He'd stopped looking 3 towns ago. Hauser was a mechanic, not a rifleman. His job was simple: salvage what could be reused, strip the rest, move to the next wreck. In 4 months he'd processed 62 destroyed vehicles. Engines, gearboxes, radios, machine gun mounts. Anything that still worked went back to the repair depot. Anything broken went into scrap piles that would eventually be melted down and turned back into tanks. The army didn't waste steel. But this morning, as he pried open the engine compartment, something caught his eye. The crankshaft. It had been blown free from its mounting, but the shaft itself was intact. Perfectly straight. Cylindrical. Machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. He lifted it out, wiped away the carbon scoring, and held it up to the early light. The balance was flawless. No wobble. No warp. Just clean, predictable rotation along a single axis. He turned it slowly in his hands. His mind, trained in precision metalwork since before the war, began calculating. Hauser had grown up in Newark, New Jersey, the son of a tool and die maker. By age 12 he could read blueprints. By 15 he was operating lathes and milling machines in his father's shop. When the draft notice arrived in 1942, he'd expected to be assigned to a factory. Instead, they handed him a rifle, taught him to shoot, and shipped him to North Africa. He never fired that rifle in combat. Within 3 weeks, a motor pool sergeant discovered Hauser could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded and reassigned him to vehicle maintenance. He spent the rest of the war under trucks, inside engine bays, elbow deep in grease and hydraulic fluid. He was good at it. Better than good. He understood how machines failed, how tolerances stacked, how small mechanical errors compounded into catastrophic breakdowns. He could diagnose a transmission problem by sound alone. He could estimate worn bearing clearances by feel. But lately he'd been thinking about a different kind of precision. The problem started 2 weeks ago. The battalion was pushing north through the Leary Valley, a narrow corridor flanked by mountains on both sides. German forces had fallen back to prepared positions on the high ground, dug into stone farmhouses and medieval towers that offered perfect fields of fire. Every advance was met with mortar barrages and machine gun fire. Every gain cost blood. But the worst part wasn't the direct fire. It was the artillery. German forward observers, hidden in church steeples and hilltop ruins, would radio coordinates to guns positioned miles behind the line. Shells would rain down with terrifying accuracy, turning roads into craters, pinning entire companies in place for hours. The Americans tried counter-battery fire, but the observers were too well concealed, too far away, and too experienced to stay exposed for long. Sniper teams tried to take them out. Standard procedure: get within 300 yards, find a stable position, wait for the target to show himself. But 300 yards meant crossing open ground under fire. It meant getting close enough that the Germans could hear you, see your muzzle flash, call down mortars on your position before you even took the shot. 3 sniper teams had been killed in the last 10 days trying to reach those towers. The battalion commander issued a standing order. Any soldier who could neutralize a forward observer would receive a 3-day pass and a commendation. But nobody could get close enough. Hauser had watched it happen. He'd seen the maps, heard the radio chatter, listened to the riflemen complain that their M1 Garins were useless beyond 400 yards. He'd seen the Springfield 1903 rifles carried by designated marksmen, scoped and accurized, capable of precision at range, but only if you could calculate the shot. And that was the real problem. Long-range shooting wasn't just about having a good rifle. It was about understanding ballistics. A bullet doesn't fly straight. It arcs. Wind pushes it sideways. Gravity pulls it down. Temperature, humidity, altitude, all of it changes the trajectory. At 100 yards you could aim and shoot. At 400 yards you had to calculate, adjust, and hope your math was right. The Army trained snipers to use Kentucky windage, a rough method of aiming off target to compensate for wind and drop. It worked at moderate range. But at extreme distance, small errors became large misses. A 1-degree error at 400 yards meant missing by 6 feet. What they needed was a mechanical reference. A device that could translate ballistic calculations into repeatable, precise adjustments. Something that could hold a fixed angle, rotate to measure crosswind, and provide consistent elevation reference across multiple shots. Hauser had been thinking about it for days. And now, holding that crankshaft in his hands, he realized he might have the answer. He carried the shaft back to his tent, along with a file, a hacksaw, and a box of miscellaneous hardware scavenged from other wrecks. He worked through the afternoon, skipping chow, ignoring the sounds of artillery in the distance. First, he filed notches into the shaft at precise intervals. Each notch represented 1 degree of elevation. He used a protractor salvaged from a destroyed survey kit to verify the angles. The steel was hard but not too hard. The file bit cleanly. Next, he fabricated mounting brackets from aluminum stripping, drilled and tapped to attach to the receiver of a Springfield rifle. The brackets held the crankshaft parallel to the barrel, allowing it to rotate freely along its axis. Finally, he attached a small spirit level, the kind used in carpentry, to the surface of the shaft. When the rifle was tilted, the level would show the exact angle. When the shaft was rotated, the level would indicate crosswind cant. It was a crude device. Improvised. Built from scrap. But the physics were sound. Hauser finished the assembly just after midnight. He held the rifle up, sighting down the barrel, rotating the crankshaft mount with his thumb. The level bubble tracked smoothly. The notches clicked into position with satisfying precision. He needed to test it. At 0200 hours he slipped out of camp carrying the modified Springfield, a box of .30-06 ammunition and a notebook. The front line was quiet, what the soldiers called false quiet, the kind that meant both sides were awake and watching but nobody wanted to start anything before dawn. He moved east, away from the main encampment, toward a section of farmland that had been abandoned for weeks. The ground was cratered and uneven, but he found a low stone wall that offered cover and a clear line of sight to the north. He set up the rifle, extended the bipod legs and checked the crankshaft level. Perfectly horizontal. He rotated the shaft 2 notches, angling the barrel upward. According to his calculations, that should compensate for bullet drop at 300 yards. There was an old fence post 280 yards out. He'd measured it 3 days ago using a surveyor's chain. He loaded a round, settled his breathing and fired. The shot cracked loud in the stillness. Somewhere behind him, a sergeant shouted. Hauser didn't move. He watched through the scope. The fence post splintered near the top. High by 6 inches. He adjusted. 1 notch down. Fired again. The post exploded at chest height. He allowed himself a thin smile. The next morning, Hauser brought the rifle to Lieutenant Myers, the battalion S2 intelligence officer. Myers was a sharp-faced West Pointer from Virginia, the kind of officer who valued doctrine over innovation. He looked at the crankshaft assembly like it was a live grenade. What the hell is that, Corporal? Elevation guide, sir. Mechanical compensation for long-range ballistic drop. Myers picked up the rifle, turned it over, frowned at the level and the notched steel. You built this out of tank parts? Yes, sir. Does it work? Tested it last night. Accurate to 300 yards. Should be effective to 400, maybe more. Myers set the rifle down. We have trained snipers, Hauser. Men who've been doing this since North Africa. If long-range shooting was just a matter of bolting junk to a rifle, they'd have figured it out by now. Respectfully, sir, our snipers are dying because they're getting too close. This lets them shoot from safer distance. Or it lets them miss from farther away. Myers crossed his arms. I'm not authorizing the use of garage junk in combat. If you want to help, go fix a truck. Hauser stood at attention. Understood, sir. But he didn't take the rifle back to the motor pool. He kept it in his tent. And he kept watching the hills. April 16, 1944. 1,420 hours. The battalion was pinned down again. They'd been trying to take a crossroads 2 miles north of the bivouac, a strategic junction that would open supply routes toward Rome. But every time the lead company advanced, mortar fire rained down with surgical precision. The shells landed in clusters, timed perfectly to catch men in the open. Casualties were mounting. The forward observer was somewhere in the hills. Probably in the old church tower on the ridge line, the one that overlooked the entire valley. Sniper teams had tried to reach it twice. Both times, they'd been spotted and bracketed with mortars before they got within 400 yards. The third sniper team was getting ready to try again. Hauser found them in a dugout behind the command tent. Sergeant Carl Voss and Private Eddie Thorne, both of them hollow-eyed and silent. Voss was checking his Springfield, loading magazines with match-grade ammunition. Thorne was marking a map with red pencil, tracing approach routes that all looked equally suicidal. You're going after the spotter, Hauser said. Voss looked up. That's the job. What's the range to the tower? 500 yards, give or take. We'll close to 300 before we shoot. You won't make it. Voss's jaw tightened. You got a better idea, mechanic? Hauser hefted his modified rifle. Yeah. Let me take the shot from here. Voss stared at him. Then at the rifle. Then back at him. From here? That's damn near 400 yards. 380 according to your map. Nobody makes that shot. I can. Thorne laughed, a bitter sound. With that? What is that, a crankshaft? It's a ballistic compensator. Mechanical elevation guide. I've tested it. It works. Voss stood up, stepped closer, examined the device. He was a sniper, trained in marksmanship, skeptical of anything that wasn't standard issue. But he was also a practical man. He'd lost 2 friends in the last week trying to close distance on targets like this. Show me, he said. They moved to the edge of the perimeter, where the ground sloped down toward the valley. Hauser set up behind a cluster of sandbags, positioned the rifle on its bipod, and glassed the church tower through the scope. It was a medieval stone structure, 3 stories tall, with narrow window slits on each level. The top level had a bell chamber open on all sides, offering a 360-degree view of the valley. He could see movement up there, dark shapes behind the stonework shifting occasionally. Spotters in the bell chamber, Hauser said. Probably has a radio, binoculars, maybe a rifle for self-defense. Voss crouched beside him, watching through his own binoculars. Winds from the west. Maybe 5 miles per hour. Temperature 72 degrees. You're shooting uphill, so gravity's going to pull harder. Hauser nodded. He'd already factored all of that into his calculations. He rotated the crankshaft 3 notches up, compensation for the 380-yard distance and the upward angle. Then he canted the rifle slightly to the right, using the level to measure a 2-degree offset for wind drift. The math was simple. The execution was not. At this range, the bullet would take nearly half a second to reach the target. In that time it would drop almost 6 feet and drift 8 inches sideways. The spotter would have to remain stationary for the entire flight. If he moved, the shot would miss. Hauser settled into position, controlled his breathing, and waited. The spotter appeared. Just a silhouette at first, moving behind the stone archway of the bell chamber. Then more distinct, a man in a gray-green Wehrmacht uniform, holding binoculars, leaning out to scan the valley below. Hauser tracked him through the scope. The crosshair wavered slightly, pulse, breathing, the natural tremor of human muscle. He slowed his heart rate, exhaled halfway, held. The spotter stopped moving. He was calling coordinates into a radio handset, his posture fixed, his attention downrange. Hauser's finger tightened on the trigger. The physics were clear in his mind. The bullet would leave the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. Gravity would pull it downward at 32 feet per second squared. Wind resistance would slow it, cause it to drift. The crankshaft compensator gave him the angle. The level gave him the cant. The rest was execution. He squeezed. The rifle cracked. The butt slammed into his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the spotter jerk backward, the radio tumbling from his hand. The man crumpled, disappeared behind the stone wall. Silence. Then Voss beside him speaking quietly, "Holy shit." Hauser worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, kept the scope on the tower. No movement. No secondary target. The spotter was down. 30 seconds later, the mortars stopped. The battalion advanced within the hour. Without the forward observer directing fire, the German mortar teams were shooting blind. Their shells landed in empty fields, in abandoned farmhouses, in sections of road the Americans had already passed. The lead company reached the crossroads by 1600 hours, secured it, and radioed back that the route was clear. Hauser was still at the firing position when Lieutenant Myers found him. The lieutenant didn't say anything at first. He just stood there looking at the rifle, at the crankshaft assembly, at the empty cartridge casing on the ground. Finally, "You made that shot?" "Yes, sir." "From here?" 380 yards. "Yes, sir." Myers crouched, picked up the casing, turned it over in his hand. "Voss says the spotter went down clean. 1 shot. No follow-up needed." Hauser didn't respond. Myers set the casing down, stood, looked toward the church tower in the distance. "I was wrong," Myers said. "About the rifle. About calling it junk." He paused. "Battalion commander wants to see you. And he wants to see that weapon." Captain Rowland was a thick-shouldered infantry officer from Texas, the kind of man who led from the front and didn't tolerate excuses. His command post was a requisitioned farmhouse with maps pinned to every wall, radio sets crackling with traffic, runners coming and going with messages from the line. He was studying a terrain map when Hauser and Myers entered. He didn't look up. "This the mechanic who made the shot?" "Yes, sir," Myers said. Roland straightened, turned, looked Hauser up and down. "You build that rifle yourself?" "Modified it, sir. Standard Springfield receiver. Crankshaft compensator for elevation and windage." "Show me." Hauser laid the rifle on the map table. Roland examined it closely, rotating the crankshaft, checking the level, sighting down the barrel. "This really works?" "It does, sir." "How far?" "I've tested it to 300 yards. Today's shot was 380. I believe it's effective to 500, maybe more, depending on conditions." Roland set the rifle down. "We've got 4 more forward observers causing problems. 2 in towers, 1 in a farmhouse attic, 1 on a hilltop bunker. Ranges from 350 to 470 yards. All of them out of reach for standard engagement." He looked at Hauser. "Can you take them out?" Hauser hesitated. He was a mechanic, not a sniper. He'd fired 1 shot in combat and it had worked, but that didn't make him an expert. There were 100 variables he hadn't tested yet. Wind shear at altitude. Temperature gradients. Ammunition consistency. But he thought about the men who died trying to close distance on those spotters. He thought about the mortars that would keep falling if someone didn't stop them. "I can try, sir." Roland nodded. "Voss will go with you. He'll spot, handle security. You focus on shooting." He tapped the map. "First target's here. Farmhouse, 410 yards. Intelligence says the observer operates from the attic window, usually shows himself around dawn and dusk. You've got 24 hours to set up." "Understood, sir." As Hauser turned to leave, Roland spoke again. "One more thing, Corporal. If this works, if you take out multiple targets with that setup, I want my engineers to replicate it. We've got 200 Springfields in this battalion. If we can turn half of them into long-range precision rifles, we change how we fight in this terrain." Hauser felt the weight of that statement. This wasn't just about 1 shot anymore. It was about proving a concept. About introducing a new capability into the doctrine. "I'll do my best, sir." April 17, 1944. 0530 hours. Hauser and Voss moved out before dawn, carrying the rifle, ammunition, and a surveyor's rangefinder. They circled west, away from the main line, using dried creek beds and stone walls for cover. It took 3 hours to reach the firing position, a low ridge 410 yards from the target farmhouse. The farmhouse was a 2-story stone structure, partially collapsed, with a tile roof and narrow windows. The attic window faced south, overlooking the road the Americans needed to use for resupply. Intelligence had observed the spotter there for 3 consecutive days, always appearing just after sunrise. Hauser set up the rifle, checked the crankshaft compensator, adjusted for the increased range. 4 notches of elevation. 3 degrees of windage cant. The math said the bullet would arc high, peak at around 200 yards, then descend into the target window. But math wasn't certainty. He needed to confirm. Voss glassed the farmhouse through binoculars. "No movement yet. We wait." They waited. The sun climbed. The valley warmed. Insects buzzed in the grass. At 0647 hours, a shadow appeared in the attic window. Then a figure. A man in a Wehrmacht uniform, setting up a tripod-mounted spotting scope. Hauser centered the crosshair, adjusted breathing, verified the level. He fired. The window shattered. The figure dropped. Voss kept watching, confirming. Target down. No movement. Hauser exhaled. 2 for 2. Over the next 6 days, Hauser took 4 more shots. Target 3, a church steeple, 390 yards. The observer was a young lieutenant coordinating artillery strikes against a bridge repair team. Hauser fired from a concealed position in a grove of olive trees. The lieutenant fell without ever knowing he was being hunted. Target 4, a hilltop bunker, 470 yards. The longest shot yet. The observer was dug into a reinforced position with sandbags and camouflage netting, nearly invisible except for the brief moments when he emerged to use his binoculars. Hauser waited 4 hours for the opportunity. When it came, he made the adjustment, 5 notches on the crankshaft, 4 degrees of windage, and fired. The bullet crossed the distance in just over half a second. The observer collapsed across the sandbag wall. Target 5, an abandoned mill, 420 yards. The observer operated from a second-floor window with a clear view of an American supply depot. Hauser and Voss approached from the east, using the morning sun to mask their movement. The shot was clean. The observer died before the report of the rifle reached him. By April 23, The battalion's advance had accelerated. Without effective forward observation, German artillery became reactive instead of proactive. The Americans could move supplies, reposition units, and maneuver without constant mortar harassment. The change was tangible. Soldiers who had spent weeks pinned in place were now gaining ground daily. Captain Roland called Hauser back to headquarters. The rifle was laid out on a workbench in the engineering tent, surrounded by 3 mechanics and a machinist from the ordnance company. They were measuring the crankshaft, sketching the mounting brackets, testing the level assembly. Roland stood to the side, arms crossed, watching. When Hauser entered, he gestured to the bench. "They're reverse engineering your design. We're making 50 copies. 50 rifles, all equipped with the same compensator system." Hauser approached, watched the men work. One of them looked up. "This is smart, Corporal. Really smart. The tolerances are tight, but we can replicate it with standard machine tools." "How long?" Roland asked. 3 days for the first batch. Another week for the rest." Roland nodded. "Good. I want them distributed to designated marksmen across the regiment. We're not making snipers, we're making long-range riflemen. Men who can engage targets at 400 yards without exposing themselves to return fire." He looked at Hauser. "You're going to train them?" Hauser blinked. "Sir, I'm a mechanic. I'm not qualified to." "You just killed 5 forward observers at extreme range using a weapon you built yourself. You're the most qualified man we've got." Roland's tone left no room for argument. "You'll teach them how to use the compensator, how to calculate windage and drop, how to set up and execute long-range shots. 2-day course. You start tomorrow." "Yes, sir." The training was conducted in a field behind the motor pool, using wooden targets set at measured distances. Hauser taught 15 men, riflemen who'd shown aptitude for marksmanship but had never trained as snipers. He started with the physics. Bullet drop is a function of time and gravity. At 300 yards, a .30-06 round fired from a Springfield will drop approximately 36 inches below the line of sight. At 400 yards, that increases to 70 inches. The crankshaft compensator gives you the angle to counteract that drop. He demonstrated rotating the notched shaft, showing how each position corresponded to a specific range. 1 notch equals roughly 100 yards of compensation. But you have to account for wind, temperature, and angle of fire. Wind pushes the bullet sideways. Cold air increases density and slows the round. Shooting uphill or downhill changes the effective range. The riflemen listened, took notes, asked questions. One of them, a corporal named Davies, raised his hand. "What if the wind's gusting? What if it's not consistent?" "Then you wait," Hauser said. "Long-range shooting isn't about speed. It's about patience. You wait for conditions to stabilize. You wait for the target to stop moving. You take the shot when everything aligns." They practiced for 2 days. Shooting at stationary targets. Adjusting for wind. Compensating for distance. By the end of the course, 12 of the 15 men could hit a man-sized target at 400 yards with reasonable consistency. It wasn't sniper-level precision, but it was enough. The modified rifles began appearing across the front line. Within 2 weeks, reports came back of successful engagements at extended range. A German machine gun team eliminated at 380 yards. A mortar spotter killed at 410. An officer coordinating a counterattack dropped at 450. The Wehrmacht started pulling their forward observers back, positioning them farther from the line, making them harder to spot and identify. But that also made them less effective. The quality of German artillery fire degraded. American units could move with greater freedom. Other battalions heard about the crankshaft rifles and requested their own. By June 1944, the design had spread to 3 divisions operating in Italy. Engineers across the theater were fabricating the compensators, modifying Springfields, training riflemen. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't a weapon that would win the war on its own. But it was an edge. A small advantage that compounded across hundreds of engagements. And it had started with a mechanic who understood machines better than doctrine. The war moved on. The battalion pushed north through Tuscany, then into the Alps. Hauser continued working as a mechanic, fixing trucks and tanks, occasionally taking long-range shots when the situation called for it. He was never officially designated as a sniper. His service record listed him as a motor pool technician for the duration of the war. But the men knew. They called him Gage because of the precision tools he used. They brought him problems that couldn't be solved with standard tactics. And when someone needed a shot made at distance, they came to him. He never missed. In November 1944, Hauser was rotated back to a rear area depot for reassignment. The fighting in Italy was winding down, and the army needed experienced mechanics for the push into Germany. Before he left, Captain Roland presented him with a commendation, Bronze Star for Valor in Action. The citation didn't mention the crankshaft rifle. It didn't mention the kills. It simply noted innovative solutions under fire, and technical expertise contributing to mission success. Hauser accepted it quietly. He didn't feel like a hero. He'd done what needed to be done, using the skills he had. That was enough. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Hauser was in Bavaria when the surrender came through, attached to an armored division processing captured German equipment. The work was the same as it had always been: disassemble, evaluate, catalog. Engines, transmissions, gun sights. He worked mechanically, methodically, the way he'd been trained. When the demobilization orders came in August, he shipped home on a Liberty ship crowded with soldiers who couldn't stop talking about what they'd do when they got back. Jobs, families, college on the GI Bill. Hauser listened but didn't participate. He wasn't sure what he'd do. The world he'd left in 1942 felt distant and unreal. He returned to Newark in September 1945. His father's machine shop was still there, still running, though his father had aged a decade in 3 years. They embraced once, didn't speak about the war, and went back to work. Hauser spent the next 40 years operating lathes, building dies, machining parts for factories and manufacturers across New Jersey. He married in 1948, had 2 children, lived quietly. He never spoke about the rifle. The crankshaft compensator faded from use after the war. With the introduction of more advanced optics, rangefinders, and ballistic computers, the improvised mechanical guide became obsolete. The rifles were returned to armories, the crankshafts stripped off and discarded. Most of the men who'd used them forgot about the device within a few years. No military manual ever included the design. No training doctrine adopted it. It existed for a brief window in 1944, solved a specific problem, and then disappeared. But the principle remained. The idea that a soldier in the field, using available materials and practical knowledge, could create a solution that doctrine hadn't anticipated, that stayed. It influenced the way the Army thought about innovation, improvisation, and adaptability in combat. Not in any formal way. Not in any document you could point to. But in the collective memory of the men who'd been there. They'd seen what was possible when someone understood the problem deeply enough to engineer an answer. In 1983, a military historian researching long-range engagements in the Italian campaign came across a reference to modified Springfield rifles with mechanical elevation guides, in a battalion after-action report. The report didn't provide details, but it mentioned a Corporal William Hauser and included a sketch of the device. The historian tracked Hauser down. He was 70 years old, retired, living in a small house in Montclair. The historian asked about the rifle, about the kills, about the design process. Hauser answered politely but without enthusiasm. Yes, he built the device. Yes, it had worked. No, he didn't think it was particularly remarkable. He'd identified a problem, applied mechanical principles, and solved it. That was what mechanics did. The historian pressed for more. How had he calculated the ballistics? What made him think a crankshaft would work? Did he realize he'd changed how the battalion fought? Hauser shrugged. I knew how machines worked. I knew how bullets worked. It wasn't complicated. The historian left unsatisfied, feeling like the story was incomplete. Hauser had given him facts, but not the weight of those facts. Not the texture of fear and improvisation and the desperate need to stop watching men die in predictable ways. The historian published a paper in a small military journal. A few enthusiasts read it. The story was mentioned briefly in a book about weapons innovation in World War II. And then it disappeared again. Hauser died in 1998 at the age of 85. His obituary in the local paper noted his service in World War II, his career as a machinist, his family. It didn't mention the rifle. His children didn't know about it. His grandchildren had no idea their grandfather had killed enemy soldiers at ranges most riflemen considered impossible. He was buried in a veterans' cemetery in North Jersey. The headstone listed his rank, his unit, his dates of service. Standard issue. Unremarkable. But among the men who'd served with him, those still alive, scattered across the country, there was quiet acknowledgement. They'd been there. They'd seen what he'd done. They knew the mortars had stopped because of a mechanic with a file and a crankshaft. Some of them still had the sketch he'd drawn during the training sessions. A simple mechanical diagram, a cylindrical shaft, notched at intervals, mounted parallel to a rifle barrel. Elegantly simple. Ruthlessly effective. They kept those sketches in attics and basements, alongside medals and discharge papers. Reminders of a war fought by men who solved problems with whatever they had. The lesson, if there was one, wasn't about the weapon. It was about the willingness to question accepted limits. The willingness to look at a problem, men dying because they couldn't shoot far enough, and refuse to accept it as inevitable. The army had doctrine. It had trained snipers, standard rifles, approved tactics. But doctrine couldn't adapt fast enough. The snipers were dying. The mortars kept falling. Hauser didn't have authority. He didn't have rank. He didn't have approval. But he had skill. He had knowledge. And he had the presence of mind to apply both when it mattered. That was the innovation. Not the device itself, but the mindset that created it. The crankshaft rifle existed for less than a year in active use. It saved lives that can't be counted. It enabled advances that weren't recorded in official histories. It represented a type of soldier the army didn't have a category for. The technical innovator, the battlefield engineer, the man who understood that war wasn't just fought with orders and courage, but with precision and ingenuity. Hauser never sought recognition. He never wrote about his experiences. He never claimed to have changed anything. But the men who survived because a forward observer died at 380 yards, those men knew. And in the end, that was enough.